I stood by the kitchen window, watching my son-in-law's car roll into the driveway, and I already understood this wasn't a friendly visit. It had been 5 days since we buried Eleanor, and in those 5 days I hadn't slept more than 3 hours at a time. Twice I forgot to eat breakfast. One morning I stood in the shower until the hot water ran out, the sudden cold finally dragging me back to reality. None of that mattered to the man walking up my front steps with a leather folder tucked under his arm. His name was Daniel, and he had married my daughter Laura 8 years earlier, in a ceremony Eleanor had spent 14 months planning. I had walked Laura down the aisle, and tried not to notice how Daniel spent most of the reception in a corner, talking with his business partner. Eleanor noticed it, though. She noticed everything. I opened the door before he could knock. George. He stepped inside without waiting to be invited, which had always been his style. I'm glad you're up. I was worried. I was 69 years old, not bedridden. I'm up, I replied. Laura came in behind him, and at least she had the decency to hug me properly, pressing her face into my shoulder the way she used to when she was 8 and frightened of thunderstorms. I held her a moment longer than she expected. Dad, she said softly. How are you doing? I'm managing. Daniel was already walking down the front hall toward the living room, studying the house the way a contractor studies a renovation project, mentally assessing everything. Eleanor and I had built this house in the way that truly matters. We chose every tile, every fixture, every color on the walls. We bought the lot in Cloverdale back in 1986 when the area was still half farmland, and we planted every tree in the yard with our own hands. The silver maple near the fence was older than Laura. The house had recently been assessed at $2.4 million, and everyone in my family seemed to know that number by heart except me. I had never once thought about it in terms of money. To me, it was simply home. The three of us sat in the living room. I made tea because Eleanor always made tea, and I needed something to occupy my hands. Laura perched on the edge of the sofa, with her fingers intertwined, something she always did when she felt uneasy. Daniel placed his folder on the coffee table and opened it. George, we want to talk with you about your situation, he said. My situation? You're living alone now in a 4-bedroom house on a large lot in a neighborhood that's changed completely around you. The practical reality is that maintaining a property like this is too much work for one person. I looked toward my daughter. She kept her eyes on her hands. The gutters were cleaned in September, I said. The furnace was serviced in October. I had the roof inspected 2 years ago, and there's at least 10 good years left on it. Eleanor kept a maintenance log in the kitchen drawer if you'd like to look at it. Daniel smiled the way people smile when they think you've missed the real point. This isn't about gutters, George. It's about the bigger picture. You're nearly 70. You're grieving. You're isolated out here. Laura worries about you all the time. Laura looked up at that, and I couldn't quite read the expression on her face. Your mother died 11 days ago, I said directly to her. I'm supposed to be sad. Of course, she said quickly. Dad, nobody's saying... What we're saying, Daniel interrupted, is that there are better options available. Lifestyle communities for active seniors. Excellent ones, actually. There's a development in Langley, another in White Rock. Full amenities, medical support on site, no property maintenance, and honestly, the proceeds from selling this house would fund a very comfortable life for a very long time. I poured the tea and remained silent for a moment. Eleanor isn't even cold in the ground yet, I said quietly. Daniel's expression didn't shift. I know the timing is difficult, George, but the market is strong right now, and I'd like you to leave, I said. Laura stood up quickly. Dad, not you. Daniel. I looked at him calmly. I'd like Daniel to leave. You can stay, Laura. You can have your tea and we can talk, but I want him out of my house. The silence stretched long enough that Daniel finally closed his folder, stood up, and walked out. The front door closed behind him almost soundlessly. Laura sat down again, and we listened to his car reverse out of the driveway. He means well, she said at last. He means your inheritance, I replied gently. There's a difference. She flinched, and guilt stabbed through me. Laura wasn't a bad person. She was a good person who had spent 8 years slowly being shaped by a man who measured everything in return on investment. I had watched it happen and said too little, too late. I'm not going anywhere, I told her. Not right now. Not while I'm still figuring out how to make a cup of coffee without automatically making two. She started crying then, quietly, and we sat together until the tea went cold. After she left, I went upstairs to the small room at the end of the hallway that Eleanor had used as her office, her sewing room, and her personal refuge from the world. It still smelled like her. The cedar sachets in the desk drawer, the soft wool of the unfinished blanket draped over the arm of her chair. I sat at her desk and opened the bottom right drawer. Eleanor had shown me the envelope 3 weeks before she died, during one of those afternoons when she was still clear-headed, alert, and characteristically direct. "Don't open it until after," she had told me, "and don't let them rush you. Promise me." I had promised. The envelope was letter-sized, cream-colored, with my name written across it in her careful handwriting. The handwriting of a woman who had taught third grade for 22 years before retiring and who still formed every letter neatly. Inside were 4 things: a folded letter, a property deed, a document from our lawyer named Rebecca Carter, and a photograph. The photograph showed a quiet lake, perfectly still water reflecting tall spruce trees, and a strip of pale sky. A narrow wooden dock stretched out from a small rocky shore. In the distance, I could see a red roof barely visible through the trees. I turned the photograph over. On the back, written in the same careful handwriting, were the words, "Lac-to-Bac area, Quebec. Hours, 2011. I've been saving it for you." I read the letter twice before I allowed myself to fully absorb what it said. Eleanor had purchased the property in the fall of 2011 during a trip to Quebec she took with her sister Dorothy. I remembered that trip. I had stayed home to look after Laura, who was going through a difficult first year of marriage that neither of us ever discussed openly. Eleanor returned from Quebec quieter than when she left, thoughtful in a way I never pressed her about. What I hadn't known, what no one had known, was that she had used money from her father's estate to buy a small lakefront property outside Rivière-du-Loup. Her father had passed away in 2010 and left her an inheritance she had never described to me in detail. We had always handled our finances independently from early in our marriage, shared accounts for household expenses, and separate ones for personal savings. It was an arrangement that worked for both of us, and we never had reason to question it. The property had a cabin with 2 bedrooms, a wood stove, and a screened porch that looked out over the water. She had hired a local caretaker named Gilles to look after it, and she had visited 4 times over the years, always when I was away at our grandson's hockey tournaments or on one of the fishing trips I took with my friend Raymond. Not once had I known. "You always said Quebec was where you would go if you could go anywhere," her letter continued. "You said it when we were 24, driving across the country. We stopped in the Laurentians, and you stood at a lookout and said, 'This is it. This is where I'd stay.' I never forgot." She wrote that she had been watching the way Daniel looked at the Cloverdale house for the past 3 years. He looked at it like a man studying something he had already decided would eventually belong to him. And Laura allowed it, Eleanor wrote, because she was tired and because she loved him, even if loving him was not always easy. "I understand that," she said. "I've let things slide myself over the years. But you, George, I won't let them manage you. You still have living left to do, and you're going to do it on your own terms, not theirs." The cabin, she wrote, was mine. It was fully paid for. Gilles had already been paid through the end of the following year, and his contact information was included with the documents. The Cloverdale house was mine as well. I could do whatever I wanted with it, but I should not allow anyone to pressure me into a timeline that suited them instead of me. Our lawyer, Rebecca Carter, had everything arranged. She had been holding the deed for 2 years, waiting for Eleanor's instructions to release it. "If you need to go, go. If you want to stay, stay," Eleanor wrote. "The important thing is that the decision is yours." Then there was one more line that stopped me cold. Rebecca also had Eleanor's updated will. She had left the Cloverdale house to Nathan rather than Laura. She wrote that she knew it would be difficult for me to read that. But she had thought about it carefully and asked me to trust her judgment. Nathan sees the world the way we do. He always has. Nathan was my nephew, my younger brother Edward's son. He was 26 and worked for a nonprofit organization in Vancouver that restored urban green spaces. He had grown up in a small apartment with Edward, who never had much money and never seemed troubled by that fact. Nathan used to visit us often when he was a teenager. One summer, he helped Eleanor plant the vegetable garden and afterward wrote her a handwritten thank you note that she kept pinned to her bulletin board for years. At Eleanor's funeral, he arrived early, helped set up chairs, stayed until the end, and washed dishes afterward without anyone asking. Laura and Daniel left the reception early because Daniel had a conference call. I sat with Eleanor's letter for a long time in the quiet of her office. I sat until the room grew dark, and I hadn't even noticed. My mind had drifted back decades, to the Laurentians when I was 24, standing at a lookout beside a woman I had known only 8 months, but already understood I would spend my life with. She had listened all those years ago, and decades later, she had listened again, remembered, and quietly acted. The next morning, I called Rebecca Carter. She was a small, precise woman in her 60s who had been managing our estate planning for 15 years. She still wore the same style of tortoiseshell glasses she had the day we first met. She told me to come by at 2 o'clock. When I arrived, everything was neatly arranged across her conference table in labeled folders. "Your wife was meticulous," she said, which was accurate, but still an understatement. "Can they challenge the will?" I asked. "Laura could attempt it," Rebecca said. But the Quebec property was purchased entirely with Eleanor's separate inheritance funds, and was titled solely in her name before she transferred it to you. There's no marital asset argument there. The Cloverdale house is slightly more complicated because it was jointly owned, but Eleanor's half transferred to you automatically under the right of survivorship. That means you now own the property outright. What you choose to do with it is entirely your decision. "And the new will?" I asked, leaving the house to Nathan. "She could contest it," Rebecca replied, "but it would be a weak case." Eleanor anticipated that possibility. 6 months ago, she had her physician formally evaluate her capacity. The evaluation confirmed she was fully competent. Rebecca allowed herself a small smile. "She came in without telling you. Said she wanted everything absolutely bulletproof." "Of course she did." "Daniel mentioned something about a competency evaluation," I said. "He claimed they had spoken to a lawyer." Rebecca looked at me steadily. "George, you missed one phone call last month and returned it the same day. You manage your finances, your household, and your personal affairs. You're grieving, which is the normal response to losing a spouse of 41 years. Those things are not the same, and no legitimate evaluator would confuse them." I drove home by a different route that afternoon, through the older section of Cloverdale. I passed the elementary school Laura had attended and where I volunteered for 3 years helping with the hot lunch program. I passed the community hall, where Eleanor organized the Neighborhood Emergency Preparedness Committee for nearly 8 years. I passed the nursery, where we bought the silver maple when it was nothing more than a thin sapling. I actually stopped there. I bought a bag of bulbs, tulips and crocuses, because the front garden beds needed something, and because Eleanor would already have been planning the spring planting. Karen and Daniel's visits resumed the following week. They were more deliberate now, more coordinated. Daniel didn't come inside again, but Laura arrived alone one afternoon carrying a printed report from a senior living consultant she had apparently hired. I listened while she went through it, pointing at photographs of bright dining rooms and carefully organized activities. "Your mom has been gone for 3 weeks," I said quietly. "I know, Dad, I know, but we need to be practical." "Practical about what exactly?" I asked. "About the fact that I'm sleeping, eating, taking my medication, maintaining the house, and seeing my friends? What exactly is the emergency?" She hesitated. "You're alone." "I'm not alone," I said. "I have Raymond, I have Dorothy, I have neighbors, I have Nathan, who was here on Saturday helping me stack firewood." I looked at her carefully. "And I have you, if you ever want to visit instead of bringing presentation materials." She cried again. Laura cried often during those weeks, which made me think something inside her was struggling to find its way through, even if she couldn't yet name it. Daniel, on the other hand, escalated things. He called twice, sent a long email outlining what he described as a realistic timeline for asset optimization, and even contacted my brother Edward, apparently hoping Edward would pressure me. Edward called afterward, sounding baffled. "He wants me to convince you to sell your house," Edward said. I told him I'd sooner convince a fence post. I appreciated that. Then came the Sunday afternoon when I returned from a walk and found Daniel's car parked in my driveway, and Daniel himself standing on my porch beside another man I had never seen before. The other man was holding a measuring tape. I stood on the front walk and looked at them. "Daniel," I said calmly, "get off my porch." "George, this is Brandon," he replied. He's a staging consultant. He was just, I didn't invite anyone onto this property, I said. Leave. You're being unreasonable. We're trying to help you. You're standing on my property without permission conducting assessments I never authorized, I said evenly. That's not help. That's trespassing. I turned to the other man. I'm sorry you were given the wrong impression about this situation. I suggest you leave. Brandon left. Daniel stayed a moment longer to tell me I was making things unnecessarily difficult, that Laura was exhausted, that the current market window wouldn't remain open forever. I stood at the base of the porch steps and let him finish. I'm going to Quebec in 2 weeks, I told him. I'll be gone for a month to start. By the time I return, I'd like both of you to understand that my home is not for sale, and my decisions are not open for discussion. He stared at me. You're going to Quebec? I have a cabin on a lake, I said. My wife left it to me. The look on his face, first calculation, then quick recalibration when he realized there was an asset he hadn't known about, was something I won't forget. It clarified things in an unpleasant way. How much is it worth? He asked. Goodbye, Daniel, I said. The next morning I called Gilles. He had a slow, steady voice and spoke a comfortable mix of French and English. He told me the cabin was in good condition, that he had repaired a section of the dock the previous summer, and that the wood stove had recently been serviced. He mentioned a pair of loons that returned to the lake every year. Your wife, he said carefully. She talked about you. She said one day you would come. She was usually right, I replied. She was very careful, Gilles continued. She asked many questions about the road conditions in winter, about the nearest clinic, about the neighbors. She wanted to be sure everything would be good when you arrived. I had to sit down for a moment after I ended the call. I told Nathan about the cabin the following week over dinner. I also told him about the will and Eleanor's decision that the house would eventually belong to him. He became very quiet. Uncle George, I can't accept that, he said. Before you object, I replied, let me tell you what she wrote. She said you understand that houses are meant to be homes. You always have. She believed that mattered. He sat silently for a long time, moving food around his plate. Then he spoke again. When I was 14, I stayed here for 2 weeks one summer while my dad was in the hospital. Aunt Eleanor and I planted the raised beds in the back. She let me design the layout. I stayed up half the night drawing it. He looked up at me. I've thought about that summer probably 100 times since. She kept your thank you note pinned to her bulletin board for 11 years, I said. He pressed his lips together and nodded. There's one condition, I told him. The garden stays. The vegetable beds, the roses, all of it. You can change anything else in the house, but the garden belongs to her. I'll expand it, he said quietly. I drove to Quebec on a Friday in April, which Eleanor would have said was too early for reliable road conditions north of the St. Lawrence, and she would have been mostly right. I hit one patch of ice outside Rivière-du-Loup, but corrected easily, trusting the old reflexes. Gilles met me at the property and walked me through everything. The cabin was small, cedar-paneled, and carried the scent of wood smoke and cold stone. The lake was still partly frozen, silver-gray beneath the afternoon light, with dark spruce trees standing against a sky just beginning to hint at spring. A pair of mergansers drifted through an open stretch of water near the dock. Gilles had left firewood stacked neatly on the porch, groceries in the kitchen, and a note on the table written in careful block letters. Bienvenue. Welcome. Gilles. I built a fire and sat in front of it for a very long time. Silence near water has a quality unlike any other silence. Eleanor had known that. For 13 years, she had quietly kept this place waiting for me, maintaining it, protecting it, saving it for the moment I would need it most. And I needed it. During the first week, I did very little. I walked along the shoreline. I cooked simple meals. I read 2 books I had intended to read for years. Each day I watched the ice slowly break apart, the lake opening from the center outward, while birds began returning in small groups. On the 6th day, a pair of loons appeared, exactly as Gilles had promised. I cried more during that first week than I had since the funeral, but it was different, cleaner somehow, without the background noise of pressure, expectations, or anyone else's plans. Just grief doing what grief does when it's given space. Laura called on the 9th day. I answered. Daniel and I are separating, she said. I waited. I've been thinking about a lot of things, about what I let him push me into, about the way I treated you after Mom died. Her voice was controlled, the way she cried now as an adult. When she was little, she had cried all at once, like a storm. I'm ashamed of how I acted. You were in a difficult situation, I said. But I chose to be in it, she replied. I kept choosing it. There was a pause. Dad, where are you? Sitting on a dock in Quebec, I said. Your mother bought me a cabin on a lake. A long silence followed, then a sound almost like a laugh. Of course she did. She saw things clearly, I said. She always did. Can I visit? She asked. Not yet, I said gently. When you're ready, I just want to know if it's possible. I looked out across the lake. A spruce branch moved lightly in the wind coming off the water. The loons called to each other across the open surface, a sound that carried loneliness and wilderness and belonging all at once. Yes, I said. Come in June, the ice will be gone by then, and the fishing is good. She ended up visiting in July because the separation took longer than expected. She arrived alone with a bag small enough for only a few days, and stood at the end of the dock for a long time before walking toward the cabin. I watched her from the porch. She had her mother's habit of standing very still when she was thinking deeply. We spent 3 days together that were better than anything we had managed in years. We went fishing and caught very little, and didn't care. We drove into town for groceries, and she spoke more French than I expected. In the evenings, we sat on the porch and talked about Eleanor in ways I hadn't been able to with anyone else. The ordinary details, the way she hummed quietly while cooking, the expressions she made when she was trying not to laugh, how she alphabetized her spice rack, but refused on principle to alphabetize anything else. She was preparing this place for you all those years, Laura said one evening. She knew. She paid attention, I said. For 41 years, she paid attention. She knew what I would need before I did. Laura was quiet for a moment. I stopped paying attention, she admitted. I let Daniel set the agenda, and I just followed along. I told myself it was practical, that I was being realistic. But really, I just didn't want to think too hard about what I actually wanted. I looked at her. What do you actually want? I asked. She thought about it for a long time. I want to do work that actually matters, she said finally. I've been in marketing for 15 years, and I'm good at it, but I don't care about it. She shook her head slowly. I want to figure out what I really think instead of just thinking whatever is convenient. That's a good place to begin, I told her. It wasn't a quick repair between us, and it couldn't be. The months after Eleanor died had shown me things about Laura that I couldn't simply forget, and she understood that. So we moved carefully. But she came back again in September, and we spoke with more honesty than we had in years. That honesty, awkward as it sometimes felt, gave us steadier ground than we'd had in a very long time. Nathan moved into the Cloverdale house the following spring, settling first into the basement suite while he figured things out. Every week he sent photographs, the raised beds repaired, the roses trimmed back, the tulip bulbs I'd planted the previous fall pushing through the soil exactly when they should. He organized something he called a seed exchange in the front yard, Sunday mornings where neighbors brought extra seedlings and cuttings. Mrs. Yamazaki from next door donated dahlia tubers. The family across the street arrived with Korean parilla and shiso. Nearly 20 people showed up the first time. Eleanor would have been unbearably pleased. I divided my time between Quebec and Cloverdale, following the seasons the way the older residents near Rivière-du-Loup did, moving when the weather changed, staying put when the lake was at its best. Gilles and I had become real friends. That first winter he taught me how to ice fish, which I had always assumed would be miserable, but turned out to be deeply peaceful, sitting inside a small hut on a frozen lake, watching the fishing line and talking about nothing urgent. In town, I found a retired woodworking teacher named Fernand, who hosted informal sessions in his garage on Tuesday mornings. He had the rare ability to make you feel capable simply by showing you the right way to hold a tool. I built a small table first, then a bench, then a set of shelves for the cabin. My hands, which had spent 40 years dealing with spreadsheets and committee meetings, discovered they actually knew how to build things. At 69, it felt like finding a room in a house you'd lived in all your life without realizing it was there. On the first anniversary of Eleanor's death, I was at the cabin. Laura drove up the evening before. Nathan took a train from Montreal, where he'd been attending a conference. Dorothy came with her husband Robert. Gilles arrived carrying a bottle of local cider. We all sat on the porch while the sun went down across the lake. I had Eleanor's final letter with me. Rebecca Carter had kept it sealed and mailed it to me with instructions to open it exactly on the anniversary. "My dear George," it began. "If you're reading this at the lake, I'm glad. If you're reading it somewhere else, that's fine too. You always found your way eventually, even when you pretended you needed directions." She wrote that she hadn't been afraid while planning everything. She had simply been practical. She wanted to know I would be all right, and the only way she could know that was by doing something about it. "You know how I am," she wrote. "I hope you've been building things. I hope you've been outside. I hope you've found people worth your time, and that you haven't allowed grief to talk you out of being exactly who you are." Then she wrote about Laura. "She isn't a bad person. She lost herself for a while inside a life that didn't fit her and made some choices I found difficult to forgive. But she's my daughter, and I believe she can find her way back if she's given the room to do it. I'm asking you to give her that room when you're ready, not because she deserves it immediately, but because you will both be better for it eventually. You're good at that, George, better than you think." She ended the letter simply. "You have more time than you believe. Don't waste it worrying about the day you might need help. Use it. Go somewhere. Build something. Learn something you've been postponing. 70 isn't the end. It's just a different beginning. You've always been better at beginnings than you give yourself credit for. I loved our life, George. All of it. Even the difficult parts. Because the difficult parts were with you. Now go make something new. All my love, Eleanor." I read the letter out loud to everyone on the porch. By the time I finished, the sun had disappeared, and the first stars were appearing over the lake. No one spoke for a while, which felt exactly right. Laura reached over quietly and took my hand. Later, after everyone had gone inside, I remained on the porch with the last of the cider and watched a loon settle onto the water for the night. Somewhere along the tree line, an owl called once and then fell silent. I thought about what Eleanor had written. 70 isn't the end. She had been 58 when she bought this place. She had driven here alone 4 different times over 13 years, walked the shoreline, sat on the dock, and slowly prepared everything without ever making it obvious. She had kept it quietly in reserve, with the patience of someone who understands that certain things take time. There are things I know now that I wish I had understood earlier. Things I would tell anyone sitting where I once sat in those first terrible weeks after the funeral, when grief, pressure, and fear all arrive at once, and it becomes difficult to separate them. Grief is not incompetence. Being sad does not mean you are incapable. The people who truly love you will wait while you regain your footing. The people who cannot wait were never really waiting for you in the first place. Your home is yours. Your time is yours. Your choices belong to you. No one has the right to claim your autonomy simply because they share your blood, because the housing market happens to be strong, or because their own plans require your cooperation. And this matters too. If someone in your life has been paying attention, really paying attention the way people do when they love you without an agenda, listen to what they were trying to show you. The proof of that attention sometimes doesn't appear until the moment you need it most. Eleanor paid attention for 41 years. She left the evidence in a cedar-paneled cabin beside a lake in Quebec, in a photograph tucked into an envelope inside the bottom drawer of her desk, in a deed prepared back in 2011 and held by a lawyer who once looked at me across her table and said, "Your wife was meticulous." She was. Meticulous and clear-eyed, and she loved me enough to plan for a future she knew she wouldn't be part of. That is a very particular and very difficult kind of love. I am 70 years old now. Most mornings I wake up to the sound of water and birds. I build things with my hands. My daughter is slowly becoming someone I recognize again. My nephew grows tomatoes in a garden that once belonged to his aunt and sends me photographs of the harvest, as if reporting to someone who still needs to see them. In a way, he is. Not every story ends neatly. The wounds left by those months never disappear entirely. They simply become part of the texture of a life, the way scar tissue becomes part of skin. Some mornings, I still reach for a second coffee cup before remembering. Some evenings, the porch feels too quiet. Some days, the grief returns without warning, and I sit with it until it passes, which it always does. But this life is one I chose. I chose this lake, this cabin, and this particular kind of silence. I chose to remain inside my own life on my own terms, rather than be managed into a version of it that suited someone else. I chose to trust what Eleanor built for me when she still had the strength to build it. And that choice is the one thing I would want anyone else to hear if they ever find themselves where I once was. You are allowed to choose. No matter how loud the pressure becomes, no matter how many brochures appear on your coffee table, no matter how often someone tries to frame your grief as evidence of decline, you are allowed to choose. Eleanor would probably say I'm being preachy. She would say it with that look that meant she knew she was right, but was willing to let me finish anyway. And she would be right, of course. She usually was. But I'm going to keep saying it anyway, because she isn't here to say it herself, and someone should.